Our next speaker is Richard Hayes Phillips. Richard, I think, has sort of adopted Ohio. He'd rather be in the woods, but he has a passion for what happened in Ohio in the 2004 election, and he will not give up. The more he sees, the more he realizes there are really weird things that happened here. Richard has been the person who's been doing the dirtiest of work, going out into the polling places, or actually the boards of elections, counties. There are 88 counties in Ohio, and he's been going to many of those counties and looking at ballots, one at a time. It's incredibly tedious work. And he's got some great things that he's going to tell us that he's heard. So welcome, Richard Hayes Phillips. Richard is from New York.
Testing. Can you hear me through the mic? Okay. No? Okay. 6 years ago in Florida, our country was reintroduced to the experience of a stolen presidential election. The Democrats were caught off guard. For 5 weeks, the vanquished candidate contested the results, but he was out-lawyered and outmaneuvered, and in the end he acquiesced to the dictates of the United States Supreme Court, which, under the Constitution, had no jurisdiction in the matter. 2 years ago, in Ohio, it happened again. Another presidential election was stolen, this time with greater sophistication. The margin of victory appeared too large to be attributed to fraud. On the very next day, the vanquished candidate capitulated. Those who questioned the results were demonized as sore losers, or marginalized as spreadsheet-wielding internet conspiracy theorists. A legal challenge to the results was dismissed by the Ohio Supreme Court, and the lawyers who brought the challenge were threatened with sanctions. During the past few months, a small but dedicated band of patriots has gathered the forensic evidence necessary to prove that the Ohio election was fraudulent. Public records requests have been submitted to 18 suspect counties. Ballots, poll books, and voter signature books from hundreds of targeted precincts have been photographed or photocopied. Preliminary findings have been filed against 11 counties in federal district court in Columbus. And a sweeping order has been issued protecting the ballots from destruction. Some of the same methods that worked so well in Florida were used again in Ohio. Heavily Democratic precincts in Cleveland and Toledo were targeted for selective purging of tens of thousands of voters from the rolls. In heavily Democratic precincts in Cincinnati, Akron, Dayton, Cleveland, Canton, Warren City, and Mansfield, ballots were punched in advance for third-party presidential candidates. causing tens of thousands of voters to spoil their own ballots by casting overvotes. The unused ballots could have told the tale, but they have been destroyed in violation of records retention laws. That is a felony. Other methods were developed especially for Ohio. Voting machines were deliberately withheld from heavily Democratic precincts in Columbus, creating long lines at the polls that disenfranchised tens of thousands of voters who could not stand in line for the duration. Voters in Cleveland and Akron were allowed to take their ballots to voting machines for the wrong precinct, so that votes intended for Democratic candidates were counted as votes for their opponents. Ballots were shifted from precinct to precinct in Warren County so that votes intended for Kerry were counted as votes for Bush, causing Kerry to receive fewer votes than down-ticket Democratic candidates, and similar patterns appear in the election results of 11 other counties. Stacks of ballots in Delaware, Butler, and Miami counties were found to have been sorted according to candidate, with hundreds of consecutive ballots for George W. Bush, indicating that fake ballots could have been substituted for real ones. Ballots in Claremont County had little white stickers pasted over the Kerry Edwards mark, with the Bush-Cheney oval filled in. In Miami County, the official numbers of ballots cast failed to match the numbers in the poll books in every single precinct. Electronic tabulators in Butler and Auglaize counties were reprogrammed without consent of the boards of elections. Electronic voting machines in Youngstown were programmed to default to Republican candidates. Even now, the Diebold tabulators in Ohio are programmed to produce 2 sets of numbers for ballots cast, one of which is derived by counting absentee ballots twice. These newfangled electronic voting machines were introduced as an improvement, a technological advance, to replace the punch cards that had gained such a bad reputation in Florida. The whole world was watching as partisan lawyers inspected and challenged every hanging, dimpled, and pregnant Chad. But undervotes were not the real story. There were 3 times as many overvotes as undervotes in Florida. Nearly all of the double-punched ballots contained a vote for a third-party candidate, and 3/4 of these were punched for Gore. That is exactly what we found in Ohio. The only difference was the identity of the victim. Now the electronic voting machines are spreading across this great nation like a cancer. If there is no paper trail, there is no accountability. All we can do is audit the voters' signature books to see if the total number of ballots cast is correct. We will not know if votes have been shifted electronically from one candidate to another. And some states are moving to electronic signature books, which, together with electronic voting machines and electronic tabulators, would make any meaningful audit impossible. Even if there were an accurate paper trail on every single voting machine, There is no way to know if the numbers reported by the machine on election night actually match the paper trail without examining the paper. In other words, counting the ballots. A partial audit will not suffice, because we know from the Ohio experience that the audited precincts will not be chosen at random. That is why more and more election observers are concluding that we must have paper ballots. Counted by hand on election night. At the precinct level. In full public view. No matter how long it takes. As is the procedure in most of the great democracies of this world. Why? Because our elections are rigged. It matters that our elections are rigged. We have no hope of changing anything through the ballot box so long as our elections are rigged. The question is this: what are we going to do about it? What if the Congress does not grant us the paper ballots that we ask for? What are we going to do about it? Are we going to try to vote them out of office on the very electronic voting machines that we already know are not to be trusted? Are we going to try and register even more millions of new voters than the millions who will be disenfranchised? My friends, we are running out of options. 230 years ago, a small but dedicated band of patriots decided that taxation without representation is tyranny and is sufficient cause to overthrow the government. King George and his ministers insisted that the colonists had virtual representation. Because although the colonists could not actually vote, the members of Parliament had the best interests of the colonists at heart. That explanation was not good enough then, and it would not be good enough now. Today, we seem to have the right to vote. We can go to the polls and go through the motions of voting, but our votes may not be counted. Or worse yet, they may be counted for candidates not of our choosing. We simply do not know. Our elections are not verifiable. These are virtual elections in a virtual democracy with virtual representation. We have as much right to overthrow the government today as we did 230 years ago. Such actions are not to be taken for light and transient reasons. But there was a long train of abuses then. And there is a long train of abuses now. The threats to our planet, to world peace, and to our civil liberties are as grave as the threat to our democracy. On the eve of the first American Revolution, few colonists thought we could prevail against the mighty British Empire, whose navy was the envy of the world. But the full force of the British Navy could not be brought to bear upon America, because Britain had a global empire to defend. Most of her military forces were committed elsewhere in the world. Also, America was King George's biggest farm and his biggest source of raw materials. Britain relied upon industrious American colonists to provide the very revenue that financed their own enslavement. And so the colonists organized boycotts and stopped paying their taxes. These actions were organized by committees of correspondence, which transmitted private communications to inform trustworthy colleagues on a need-to-know basis of impending actions and the reasons for them. In this time of crisis, we must learn from their experience. We are not going to overthrow the government through a military uprising. That would surely bring about martial law, which would very likely subject the entire countryside to armed occupation, except for a few scattered areas of resistance. But we do have the advantage of knowing that American military forces are committed elsewhere, overextended as never before in our history. Soldiers are being impressed against their will for 2 and even 3 tours of duty overseas, with no formal draft to replace them. The time to strike is now. The American government is running some of the largest deficits in its history, spending much more money than it takes in. It cannot afford a sharp drop in revenue at this time. Even if the Republicans were to increase tax rates in response, which they do not like to do, recent history has shown that this never results in significant additional revenue. It is cuts in tax rates which stimulate economic growth that actually result in additional revenue, provided, of course, that everyone pays their taxes. I can see no other way to bring down this government than for millions of us to stop paying taxes. We must sap the government of its lifeblood. They always say that the income tax is voluntary, so let us take them at their word. We don't like how they spend our money anyway. Those of us who are on payrolls and are subject to tax withholding may find this more difficult to do. Although there are ways to reduce the amount of withholding, and with enough creativity, ways to become self-employed. The rest of us have no excuse. We must act courageously in the face of danger, because it is far more dangerous if we do nothing. The safest method of tax resistance is to file an honest tax return but pay them little or nothing. We must do everything we can to reduce our tax liability. We must make ends meet by reducing our expenses, not by increasing our income. We must volunteer our services to each other in cooperative ventures whenever possible. We must engage in the barter system whenever possible. We must become as self-reliant as possible. I have done these things, and so can you. Above all, we must stop preaching to the choir. We will not restore the Republic by communicating with each other about trivial observations over the heavily monitored internet. We must learn to use pen, paper, envelopes, and stamps to communicate about matters of grave concern among trusted compatriots on a need-to-know basis. We must win this battle one convert at a time by getting to know our neighbors. We must have real relationships, not virtual ones, if we are to have a real democracy, not a virtual one. What we need are numbers, millions of us, displaying our righteous anger, not for one day, but on a sustained basis, enough to make them afraid of us, enough to make this country ungovernable without our consent. Only then will they be forced to surrender the reins of power and restore the government to the people. They will not do it voluntarily. A mere display of numbers in the streets will not suffice, because they know we cannot vote them out of office, whereas 40 years ago we could. Most of us in this fledgling movement are getting on in years, and that is no accident. We are old enough to remember the days of the Republic, when elections could be won by grassroots organizing. Now we live in the early days of empire, with our beloved Republic still a living memory. Succeeding generations may understand how easy it is to hack a computer, but they will have no first-hand memory of the Republic, and will be far less likely to fight for the restoration of liberties they themselves have never known. My friends, it is up to us, every one of us. Self-governance is our heritage, our birthright. We must finish the work of our founders, give our last full measure of devotion, testing whether the American government will allow a velvet revolution to succeed, knowing that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. Heaven help us all. Yes.
How is that? How could you organize selective purging?
Please repeat the question.
The gentleman here wants to know how you could organize selective purging. The article by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in Rolling Stone magazine noted that efforts to challenge the right to vote of persons who managed to remain on the voter rolls was done according to zip code. That is one way to do it. It was actually Rolling Stone magazine for whom I did the study of purges in Cuyahoga County and the amazing Vicki Lundgren already had the data, so I didn't have to pry it loose from the Board of Elections. One would think that the percent of voters purged would bear some relationship to the percent of persons who had not voted in recent elections. That's why you purge voters. We found no such correlation in Cuyahoga County. Whereas 25% of the voters were purged in Cleveland. More than 30% in some entire wards. More than 50% in one precinct. By contrast, in some of the Republican suburbs, fewer than 10% of the voters were purged. And I started wondering, gee, did those Republican towns actually have 90% turnout in 2000 in Bush v. Gore? No, they didn't. The percentage of voters purged in Cuyahoga County is much more closely correlated with the percent of the vote that Gore got in 2000 than it is with the percent of people who didn't vote.
So are you saying someone looked at this and said, to influence the election hypothetically legally, he will commence to do this purging based on what you just said? I hope I'm expressing that correctly, that it actually was a verbal communication or said this is what we're going to do it.
I am not privy to verbal communications among members of either party or of the boards of elections. So I don't know what happened behind closed doors, but the numbers indicate that this was not done fairly. That is undeniable. As I've told the media before, it is my job to find out what, where, when, why, and how. That's a big job. It's their job to find out who. Where is the press? Where is the independent press that Thomas Jefferson so jealously guarded and protected? I don't know who did these things. I just know that they happened. I found similar things in other counties. In Lucas County, %40 of the voters who were challenged were in 4 wards in Toledo that voted 85% for Kerry. In Hamilton County, 95% of the rejected provisional ballots came from Cincinnati. One can look at the numbers and see the racial discrimination. I don't need to know who said what behind closed doors. It'd be interesting. But I'm a historian. I hope I'm doing more than chronicling for future generations the death throes of America as we knew it. But for me, it is sufficient to document what happened. It is up to all of us to do something about it. This declaration I submitted to the Federal District Court in Columbus, Ohio, much to the consternation of some New York City attorneys who didn't want any mention of fraud in federal court, and who had forgotten that things can be done face-to-face in a virtual world and that you don't need an internet passcode to hand something face-to-face to a clerk of courts and get it filed for the record. This is on the World Wide Web. It's on my website as JPEG files. I also have it in Microsoft Word files that can be emailed to any of you. I understand it's been posted on the Free Press website as well. That's where my preliminary findings based on the actual forensic evidence, ballots, poll books, and voter signature books are contained. And my investigation is ongoing. I reserve the right to revise my findings as I review more evidence, but I reviewed enough evidence quite obviously to convince a federal judge that it all needed to be protected from destruction. Yes?
Richard, thank you so much. I mean, what you've done for us in giving us hard and fast evidence is phenomenal. Your role model in taking things into your own hands and not listening to lawyers saying, we're afraid to say this, or we're afraid to do that, or we can't get through the bureaucracy, and acting person to person. I'd like you, as things quiet down, and as they get a little bit more quiet, I would really appreciate your repeating the facts about the overvotes that you found. My reasoning for asking you to repeat it so that it can sink into the skin and the minds of everybody here is because, number one, it is so astounding. Number two, I don't know if people here know that one of the flim-flam reasons that HAVA was placed on us, and which is part of the law, is that there were so many overvotes. And they created the overvotes themselves and then shoved the machine down our throats with the excuse that they created. So if you would repeat that, your astounding facts, I'd appreciate it before you leave the stage.
What Adele has just stated, I agree with. The rationale for moving to electronic voting and all but outlawing punch cards was because the punch cards created so many undervotes and overvotes. And we all saw the lawyers fighting over the undervotes. But in Ohio, I saw very few hanging chads and dimpled chads. This was not a significant story in Ohio. In Ohio, as in Florida, most of the ballots that were not counted as votes for president were overvotes, especially in punch card counties. They had 2 or more punches for president, just as had happened in Florida. And they can talk about the butterfly ballot all they wanted, but that didn't induce anybody to vote twice. That induced people to vote for the wrong candidate. That didn't create overvotes. I noticed early on, within weeks of the election, that certain counties in Ohio had extraordinarily high rates of ballots not counted as votes for president. Very few county boards of elections actually distinguished between undervotes and overvotes, or even reported the sum total. But it wasn't hard to figure out. I used one of my advanced statistical techniques. It's called subtraction. I took the number of ballots cast and subtracted the number of votes counted for president, and the remainder was the number of votes that weren't counted for president. That wasn't hard. People want to know how come I'm an expert. Well, there's 3 reasons. I'm the one who looked at the evidence. I can do 4th grade math, and I can smell a rat. That's all I need. So, it turned out that in these counties, nearly all of the precincts with the highest percentage of votes of ballots that didn't contain a vote for president were in heavily Democratic precincts in the inner cities that went 90, 92, 95, 98% for Gore. Come on. These are African American precincts. That's what we're talking about here. There is no physically identifiable voting bloc in the Republican Party as vulnerable to targeting as the black voters who tend to vote so heavily Democratic. It's a very dangerous situation. So I tried to figure out why so many of these uncounted punch cards didn't have votes for president. I mean, why didn't the tabulators read these votes? One would think that in any election, there would be people who don't like any of the candidates and don't vote for any of them and deliberately cast an undervote. One would expect far more of those than the number of people who actually vote twice for the same office. But I found exactly the opposite in these precincts. The complete reverse of the statewide pattern, where most of the uncounted ballots in these heavily Democrat precincts had 2 or more punches for president. 1 or more third-party candidates were punched, as well as the punch for Kerry. I have photographed 1,920 of these double-punched ballots. They constitute 1 out of 12 of the uncounted undervotes and overvotes in 6 counties. I may reasonably conclude from that there are tens of thousands of them. And you know what? You all know about ballot rotation if you live in Ohio. The order in which the candidates' names must appear on the ballot, or in the case of punch card counties on the voting machines, must rotate from precinct to precinct. There were 5 candidates. So there were 5 ballot rotations. The first precinct on the list is alphabetical. Then the candidate on the top of the list goes to the bottom and the others move up. And that's how it works in every county in the state by law. So in what is known as the second rotation, which is 1 out of 5, the first candidate alphabetically, that's Badnarik, goes to the bottom of the list. So the names appear this way, from top to bottom. Bush, Kerry, Nader, or should I say candidate disqualified, Perutka, and Badnarik. The major party candidates are on top. There's a black hole in the middle. And the third party candidates are on the bottom. By far, the precincts with the second ballot rotation had many, many more of these double punch ballots than the other precincts. Why? Because whoever did this would rather punch a hole way down on the column, knowing that very few voters will punch for Bush or Kerry, but in these precincts almost all of them were Kerry voters, way up at the top of the column, and then scroll down with their eyes just in case somebody had already punched a hole for them. No, they're going to turn the page of the book and go on to column number 2. Now, some people will take their ballots out, check for hanging chads, and notice that there are 2 punches for president. You know, some people did this. They came up to the table and said, I don't know how I did this. There's 2 punches for president. Could I have another ballot? I don't know how I spoiled my ballot. I'm really embarrassed. A lot of people wouldn't even notice. Other people would be too embarrassed to say anything about it. Very few people actually looked at their ballots in advance to see if somebody had already punched them for them. But 5 people filed complaints and said, yes, indeed, that happened. One woman in Cleveland brought her ballot back up to the poll workers and said, mine's already punched for a presidential candidate. I need another ballot. And they handed her another one, and that was already punched too. She got 2 of them. I don't know what precinct. I don't know the specific precinct in any of these 5 cases, unfortunately. But most of them were in Cuyahoga. And I thought, it just didn't occur to me that this was widespread until I started looking at the ballots. And I had a lot of reasons to look at ballots in Cleveland. There were a lot of stories in Cuyahoga County. It was, an auditor's dream or nightmare, depending on the mood you're in. So I had a bit more of a representative sample, but 46% of the uncounted ballots I looked at had double punches for Kerry and for 1 or more third-party candidates. That's what made me send emergency records requests to 5 more urban counties. And I generally requested to look at the precincts that had the highest percentage of uncounted ballots. The most interesting one was Hamilton County, Cincinnati. If one sorts the precincts according to the percent of ballots that didn't have votes for president, 29 out of the top 30 had the second ballot rotation. Imagine that. There's only a chance in 5 of having Bush and Kerry on the top of the list, but somehow 29 of the worst 30 precincts where there were 1,000 ballots that weren't counted for president out of 11,000 cast. 9%. For some reason, 29 out of the 30 had this same rotation where the third-party candidates are way down at the bottom of the card, where that punch is a little bit obfuscated by a 3-punch array that's at the bottom of every punch card in Ohio and signifies absolutely nothing unless to obfuscate the bogus punch. So that's what we did. And we photographed these ballots, and we have them entered into evidence. And what's the counter-argument? In every 5th precinct, in precinct 2 and 7 and 12 and 17, in every precinct where the number ends in a 2 or a 7, voters are really stupid and more prone to make this error? I don't think so. This is fraud, ladies and gentlemen, and we cannot take back this government unless we overturn the system that allows these elections to be stolen.
Rich,
Could I tell a corroborating story about that?
hey,
On the way back from Nashville, I got on the plane with a videographer, and I was talking about the double punch ballots that Greg Palast had reported in Ohio. And she said, oh yes, it happened in Florida. And in Florida, the union man who was asked to double punch refused. This will come out on a film. It's been held back, so I'm not giving details. But they went, the investigative reporter and the videographer who were shooting, after they got this story, went and met the union printer who refused. He had retired, he moved to Arizona. He allowed the reporter and the videographer in. The door was open and he was sitting there with a gun. He was so afraid for his life. He corroborated the story. It wasn't just Ohio. I give this in my talk. This double punched. More states than here.
I need to explain one more thing also about the unused ballots. I wanted to look at those because I thought if I could find even one that was already punched, there'd be hell to pay. Well, you know what? In Hamilton, Montgomery, Stark, Summit, and Trumbull counties, These unused ballots have been destroyed. According to the records retention schedule, as interpreted by J. Kenneth Blackwell, these boards of elections were to have retained all ballots, used and unused, for 22 months. It was a felony to destroy them. In Hamilton County, at least, I am quite certain that the people I worked with, the director, the deputy director, the man who provided me the data that I used to select the precincts, none of these people had anything to do with it. They were as surprised as we were to find those ballots missing. But Hamilton County is the only one where the director and the deputy director have had the courage to acknowledge in writing that they don't have these unused ballots. I single them out because those are not the actions of guilty parties. Maybe they'll actually figure out what happened. But I have a hard time believing that the same scam was perpetrated in county after county after county without somebody talking. Conspiracies, by their very nature, must involve the smallest number of people. It seems more likely to me that this was done in advance, before these punch cards were put in pads and shrink-wrapped and delivered to the boards of elections. I fear we may never know. We need a canary to sing.
Richard's going to be around. He may be around in the workshops, or just nab him and he'll talk. He'll talk about this.